Chapter 14 Things Hidden. July 12th, 6 a.m. General Smith's personal briefing room, just beneath his home on Sublevel 6. The General had assembled heads of staff, hoping to get some answers and form a new strategy. In attendance were Commander Gloria Singer, Colonel and Operations Manager Akira Shimoto, Captain and Security Coordinator Rolf Luger, Captain and Head of Medicine Dr. William Katz, Warrant Officer and Information Gathering Specialist Jonas Black, and Warrant Officer Sin Kai, a specialist in ethereal and extra-dimensional studies. With everyone seated, Mikhail walked through the old wooden doors. Everyone stood and came to attention upon Mikhail's entry to the room. He looked about for a moment, looking each in the eye for just a short moment, then put the crew at ease. Lieutenant Cogito's chair remained empty, with a black rose on the table. General Mikhail performed the roll call. "Commander Gloria Singer." Gloria answered, "Present, sir." General Mikhail called out, "Colonel Akira Shimoto." Akira called out, "Here, sir." General Mikhail called out, "Captain Rolf Luger." Rolf barked out stoically, "Present, boss." General Mikhail called out, "Captain William Katz." Dr. Katz spoke softly and somberly, "Present, sir." General Mikhail called out, "Mr. Jonas Black." Jonas spoke in a tight and reserved way, "Here, sir." General Mikhail called out, "Miss Sin Kai." Singh answered softly, "Present, sir." General Mikhail called out, "Lieutenant Manuel Cogito." There was no answer, as everyone looked over to the empty chair. General Mikhail called out 2 more times, "Lieutenant Manuel Cogito." "Lieutenant Manuel Cogito." Everyone then lowered their heads and remained silent for 30 seconds. General Mikhail looked up again, letting his gaze pass over everyone present. Mikhail walked over to a nearby communications panel and spoke to his friends, to his co-workers, to his family. "Attention all crew, employees, and honored guests. It is with great sadness and pride that I inform you that 467 of our brothers and sisters have made the ultimate sacrifice for our cause. Many have acted with valor and with exceptional heroism. Some were simply caught in a bad place at a critical time. No words, no condolences, and no level of recognition will replace the void left in those who knew these people. A list of every brave soul will be published in the Core periodical tomorrow morning. If anyone is unaccounted for, but not on this list, report it immediately to the head of your department. No one will be left behind. There will be a special service conducted tomorrow morning in Community Center 12 at 9 a.m. Any persons not performing critical duties at that time are required to be found in attendance. There will be further updates when more information is discovered. For now, be vigilant, remain strong, focus on your objectives. And don't forget, if someone falls, help them up." General Smith out. General Smith closed the communication panel and brought his attention back to the meeting. The meeting took place in a secret subterranean room known only to the general and his chiefs of staff. The dark, wood-paneled walls were adorned with old-looking paintings of what appeared to be wartime in feudal Japan. Samaria, Shogun, and Ronin were set to the field of battle. However, in the painting, instead of warring with rival clans, they were set to war against masses of undead in a place called Nebraham Forest, Tarothar. The table for this meeting was rectangular and black, being made of seared brazen wood. The chairs were also made of brazen wood, with wide and long armrest and a purple cushion on the bottom and on the backing of the chair. The general sat at the middle of the table. To his right sat Shimoto, Luger, and Katz. To his left sat Black, Kai, and Cogito's spot, which was empty. Gloria Singer stood behind the general as he sat down into his seat, as she would typically handle displays, screens, or other means of access to information to be shown, distributed, or memorized at such a meeting. Mikhail looked over his shoulder and did something most uncharacteristic of himself. Looking over his shoulder at Gloria, Mikhail spoke. "Commander, I'm going to need you to finish your sweep, then sit and join us." Gloria nodded with a singular bow of her head and replied, "Yes." Using a scanning instrument with a small view screen and several HUDs, Gloria finished checking all the doorways, corners, nooks, and vents to be sure that no devices were spying on the meeting. When Gloria was sufficiently convinced that the room was bug-free, she sat in a chair to the General's right side. General Smith asked, "Commander, are we clear?" Commander Singer replied, "No tracking, spying, or scrying devices or constructs have been detected. We should be clear to commence." General Smith folded his hands and rested them on the surface of the porous black table. He let out a short sigh, releasing a deep exhale at the same time. Gathering himself in, Mikhail prepared to speak. Mikhail allowed his gaze to wander from one person to another person as he spoke. "As you well know, Lieutenant Kogito is our primary science officer. A replacement will be arriving from Base 86 a week from now. Until then, Dr. Katz will be pulling double duty as head of medical and applied sciences. In the interim, and in recognition of valiant behavior, James Battalion has been promoted to the position of acting warrant officer and will be assisting Dr. Katz in the field of science research." General Smith first addressed the entirety of the table. "I've brought you all here to make your reports in person, for obvious reasons. Nothing spoken of in this room is to be shared with any non-essential personnel. Gossip and opportunities to leak information must be kept to a negative quantity." General Smith paused, then focused his attention on Dr. Katz and spoke in serious tones. "Dr. Katz has a report that he will be sharing only verbally, as do the rest of you. Doctor, your report." Dr. Katz adjusted his bifocal lenses, then spoke. "Yes, sir. Firstly, following up on Mr. Weiser, we have stabilized him, but he's still in critical condition following the attempted suicide. We could normally treat a sword wound to the body, but the blade was laced with some sort of toxin we've not yet been able to identify. He is being kept in suspended rest until we can devise an antibody to the poison in his bloodstream. His prognosis is indeterminate. We were fortunate to even be able to rescue him from the hospital building before it was completely destroyed." General Smith nodded and replied, "Keep on it. What were you able to learn from Emily's body?" Dr. Katz looked down at the table for a moment, then returned his gaze upward to the rest of the crew. "There is something unique about Emily's DNA," the General inquired. "Unique?" Dr. Katz continued. "Some form of procedure or aberrant mutation has altered her DNA on a subatomic level. A full analysis of the DNA revealed more questions than answers." The General inquired again. "How so?" The others in attendance were quiet and kept their attention focused on each speaker. The doctor took a deep breath, then let it out slowly before responding. "Quite frankly, sir, her body contains element we can't locate on any table of elements for any known world." Commander Singer raised her hand up, and when the General gave her a nod, she spoke. "Doctor, have you checked the alchemical charts for a match?" The doctor answered, "No, ma'am. Supernatural studies are not my specialty." Commander Singer answered back, addressing the journal. "Sir, if we can't understand what we see in the natural, I would advise a pursuit in search of the supernatural. I believe we'll find our answers there." General Smith thought for a moment, then spoke. "Miss Kai, you are a resident specialist in the occult and supernatural. Would it be possible for you to examine the young girl's body and find some answers?" Miss Sin Kai responded in a soft tone. "I can." General Smith spoke to the doctor. "I will be having Miss Kai assist you in your work. My hope is that if the two of you work together, that you will be able to find answers you couldn't find separately." Miss Kai and Dr. Katz simultaneously answered, "Yes, sir." The General then redirected his attention to Captain Rolf Luger. "Captain Luger," Rolf answered. "Sir." General Smith continued, "What do we know about the mole situation?" Captain Luger reported, "My team and I have collected evidence suggesting that a communications officer, one Reginald Fledge, was a double agent. Emergency security footage captured images of Warrant Officer Fledge executing his partner of 20 years, Daniel Briggs. Recorded evidence also suggested that this rogue officer had help from several key positions throughout the base, at least 50 officers." General Smith reacted, looking alarmed. "We had that many compromised officers?" Captain Luger answered, "No, sir. We believe them to be missing." General Smith inquired, puzzled. "Missing? Captain Luger nodded. Yes, sir. I was able to confirm with help from Dr. Katz and with information shared by Mr. Jonas Black. We've confirmed that the Necrosidious have a new shape-shifting variety. General Smith turned his head, glaring straight at Rolf with a morbid expression. A shapeshifter? Captain Luger continued. An investigation uncovered several key officers tapping their hand during the assault. Oh, tipping their hand during the assault. When security teams tried to take these officers into custody, they resisted and fought back with lethal force. When the security teams fought back, they found the officers to be possessed of superhuman abilities beyond those normally attained by our officer class. When killed, in the moment before death, they reverted to their necrosidious forms just before they disintegrated. We caught several instances of this on camera. Directly on camera. The general continued. And you're confident that these officers were necrosidious impostors? Captain Luger retorted. Yes, sir. When we examined their ashes, we found a chemical we could not identify. This chemical was unique to those we found to be in disguise. The general nodded, then turned to Warrant Officer Sin Kai. Miss Kai, I will need you to also examine the necrosidious remains. Both seem to contain unidentifiable elements. These things may be connected. Officer Kai responded, Yes, sir. I will coordinate my teams. General Smith interrupted, No. Meet the doctor unofficially. Arrange a casual meeting for entertainment and do your research under that guise. Let no one but the doctor know. Then have the doctor report his findings directly to me. Dr. Katz agreed. Yes, sir. We'll see what we can dig up. The general took the lead over the conversation again. Was there anything else, Captain Luger? Rolf answered quickly, then paused. Yes, as read earlier, casualty reports, not counting the missing officers, confirm 467 dead and about 600 serious injuries. We're down to a skeleton crew until we get more medical supplies to heal the gravely injured. The strikes on our hospital and medical supplies were precise. Whoever orchestrated the strike had intimate knowledge of nearly all policies, procedures, and locations. General Smith inquired further. Are we still operating under the separatist theory? Captain Luger answered in a tired-sounding voice. Hard to say, sir. But half the crew disappearing about the same time the world split up into all its dualities seems to be a bit more than just odd coincidences. General Smith nodded, then turned to face Warrant Officer Jonas Black. Mr. Black, what have you uncovered? Jonas sat up a little straighter, adjusted his collar, then spoke. Sir, collected data still seems to suggest that an outside force was behind the joining of the two parties we now know as the Red Union, and considering the Red Union's recent leaps in technology, it remains at least possible that the Separatists have joined with the Red Union in hopes of getting the better of us. General Smith inquired, Can we prove that? Mr. Black shook his head subtly. No, but it is the most likely explanation at this time. I can also confirm reports that such attacks took place on 37 other bases. They are reported to have repelled the attackers, but like us, they all took heavy losses. General Smith twisted his mouth to one side as he thought, then spoke. We have to maintain the highest alert levels. We'll be moving to Situation Yellow. The general then turned his attention back to the doctor. Doctor? Dr. Katz responded, Yes, sir. General Smith continued, Doctor, I need you to get some temporal readings from every accessible enemy soldier, alive or dead. Dr. Katz puzzled. Temporal? The general replied, Yes, I've got a hunch, a feeling in my gut, and my gut feelings are seldom, if ever, wrong. Dr. Katz replied, We'll look into it, sir. The general quickly moved on to the next topic. Commander Singer. General Smith reached into the left breast pocket of his uniform, removing a 2-inch thick stack of papers grouped into stapled-together booklets, each about the size of a religious tract. He then passed the booklets to Commander Singer. He called out, Colonel Shimoto, Captain Luger, and so on, giving each person called out a handwritten copy of their new orders. Once the general had completed handing out the orders, he stood at the center of the table between the two groupings of people on either side. The general then discreetly reached into a holster on his back underneath his uniform. He removed a pistol, which looked to be an old 6-shooter. While he was doing this, Colonel Shimoto puzzled over her orders. As the colonel peered over her orders, they were just multiple pages repeating the phrase, "You fucked up." Colonel Shimoda spoke up, looking a bit worried. "Sir, I don't understand." The general cocked back the hammer on the old single-action pistol. The colonel's eyes opened wide. General Smith then answered, "Colonel Shimoda was a valiant and brave soldier I would trust my life to any day, and she died selflessly 2 days ago, protecting a daycare facility from a horde of vampires." The colonel flinched, about to make a rushed movement, but Mikhail squeezed the trigger to the old gun first. An Omni round went through her back and into her heart. Everyone else at the table put their hands in front of their faces in total surprise as the colonel's body erupted into embers and then ash, taking on the appearance of its former self before evaporating into ash and smoke, screaming as it burned to death from the inside out. General Smith blew the smoke from the pistol barrel as the last of the imposter's ashes fell to the bottom of the chair and the floor. While the general made an angry-looking stoic expression, everyone else present had to pick their jaws up off the floor and regain their composure. General Smith wiped his nose using his wrist, still holding on to the old revolver pistol. He then set the pistol down on the table in front of his spot. Next, he calmly sat down in his chair, reached into his right breast pocket, produced a cigar from an old-looking tin, then pulled an old flint lighter from the opposite pocket and lit up the cigar, taking several small puffs. General Smith then asked, "Are there any other questions?" Everyone stared at each other for a moment, not speaking. General Smith repeated, "I said, are there any questions?" Everyone answered, mostly in unison, sounding a little shaken up. "No, sir. No questions, sir." The general took a puff of his cigar, rolled the smoke around his mouth some, then set the cigar down into an old nearby metallic ashtray on a stand. He then reached into his right side pants pocket and produced a small metallic flask. He popped the cork, took a sip of the old whiskey inside, and put the cap back on, and put the flask back. He swallowed the whiskey, then let out a sharp breath. First crackling his neck side to side, then folding his hands together and putting on a stern face with pursed lips, Mikhail spoke. "You've all been given orders. It is of the utmost imperative to our survival that we find the answers we seek. We need to know what is polarizing everyone. We need to know who is supplying the Red Union. We need to know more about these Necrocidius. Most importantly, we need to know what they were after that was so important that they would risk blowing all of their anonymity just to attain it. It suggests that whatever it is they are seeking would make them so powerful they would no longer fear us, and we need to know exactly what that is." The general then took one more puff of the cigar, then extinguished it, smooshing 3/4 of it into the ashtray. The general observed the silence for a moment, took a breath, then spoke. "If there is nothing else, you are dismissed." Everyone looked around a bit, then spoke, somewhat out of sync. Sir! Sir!" The staff got up out of their chairs and left the room, making their way to the elevator, accompanied by Commander Singer. Only Jonas Black remained behind. The general had cupped his face with his hands, closing his eyes for a few moments. When he lowered his hands and opened his eyes, he saw Mr. Black still sitting in his seat. Mikhail spoke in a tired voice. "Mr. Black, you do understand that dismissed means get the fuck out, right?" Jonas answered flatly, "Yes, sir. However, there is something you must be made aware of." Mikhail answered, "The proper time to do that would have been before I told you all to get the fuck out." Jonas responded again, still in a flat tone of voice. "There is a security concern, and concern for our officers at play, and it would be inappropriate to mention it in front of the other officers." Mikhail, becoming somewhat agitated with the vagueness of the conversation, spoke in a snappy way. "Mr. Black, spit it out." Jonas winced with only his eyes, but remained calm otherwise. "Sir, it's about Captain Luger and his daughter." Mikhail raised an eyebrow, inquiring, "The daughter who died in the explosion at the train station a year ago?" Jonas nodded somberly. "You may have reason to believe she is alive." Mikhail retorted, "Of course, he's a grieving father. You can't blame him for trying to hold on to hope." Jonas tilted his head slightly to one side, nodded, then looked at the general more directly, and then spoke. I also have reason to believe that Sarah may be alive. The general's eyes tightened along with the rest of his face as Jonas spoke, but he continued to listen. Jonas continued, What I did not include in my report was that on our last mission I discovered evidence at that same train station indicating that Sarah had possibly been there. Mikhail countered, What evidence? Jonas answered, A syringe with DNA on it. 2 types, actually. Mikhail waited as Jonas continued. Jonas continued on. One set of DNA matched Sarah's. The other was a match to an ex-member of the Corps, Chance Tinkerman. Mikhail responded, then probed a little. I recall that Mindy, the mother of the child, left Rolf for Chance. But what about the syringe itself? Jonas answered, fidgeting some in discomfort. Ketamine, sir. Mikhail added, Child traffickers often drug their victims, and we know the old train station had a reputation. So the question is... Jonas picked up where Mikhail left off. DNA tests showed that Sarah is Rolf's biological daughter, and that Mindy is the mother. Mikhail included, The question is, why were they at a train station in Pampa Hindi? Jonas nodded a bit, then replied, Mindy seems to think Sarah would be in danger of living on nomadic base. She may have seen Chance as an opportunity for escape from that situation. Mikhail squinted some, then relaxed his face more and replied, using a somewhat drawn-out voice, Maybe, but there's something missing, and that missing piece is between us and the answers. Jonas nodded, then spoke, changing his tone from informative to prescriptive. This is a family matter, sir. Mikhail gave a small nod, but then spoke firmly. Mr. Black, I appreciate your candor in coming to me with this, but this is not the time. Nonetheless, when the time is right, we will address this. Right now, I need you to cooperate with Katz and Battalion. Until we figure out what's happening to the world, I need your attention here, finding the answers we seek. If we can't clean that up, that problem, there won't be any family left to sort out. I need your head in the game. General Smith then addressed Warrant Officer Black. Is there anything else? Jonas responded crisply. No, sir. General Smith nodded once, then spoke sternly. Good. Then get the hell out of my office. Jonas barked out. Sir! Gave a salute, and when it was returned, about-faced and left the room. Jonas walked out with a smile on his face, because, when the general says, get the hell out of my office, this is a term of endearment used only with his favorite people. Jonas knew he had the general's support, and found some solace in that. Special Ward 13, on Sublevel 7, 9:21 a.m. Special Ward 13 had been set up to accommodate medical research. A vast array of devices, tools, and techs were available to suit many a situation. One could perform surgery, an autopsy, or a medical quarantine using the trove of scientific and paranormal tools and knowledge at one's disposal. The body of Emily Weiser was suspended in a cylinder-shaped cryochamber with a tall window on one side. Only a hospital sheet covered her body. Before transferring her to the new unit, Dr. Katz did her the service of closing her one eye. Next to the cryochamber was a hospital bed in which Connor Greenleaf lay in some sort of coma. Dr. Katz and the newly appointed Mr. James Battalion were pouring through mountains of data on computer monitors, trying to find some answer as to what was so unique about Emily's DNA. Dr. Katz shook his head and spoke. Nothing. No match to anything. What have you got, Jimmy? Or should I say, Mr. Battalion? James looked up from his computer screen. Jimmy works just fine, and we have negative matches on all the unknowns. At the door to the lab stood 2 mech defenders and 2 of the elite samurai-style guardians. The door hissed open, getting the attention of the guards. The open door revealed the visage of Miss Sin Kai. One of the elite guards made a visual confirmation, then checked her ID, and finally administered a DNA test via an oral swab. Once all of those things were confirmed, Miss Kai would be cleared to be let in. She was carrying some object in a black box. The guards insisted on scanning that as well, to check for explosives or some other hazardous items. When that was done, the guards finally let her through. Miss Kai set the old-looking box onto a nearby table. Dr. Katz looked up from his work, then asked, What have we here, Miss Kai? Sin Kai opened the lid of the shoebox-sized black box, then turned the box so that the doctor and the security officer could see the contents. The inside of the box was lined with purple satin. The contents were a very old-looking book and what would appear to be a wand made from translucent crystal. Runes were carved into various sections of the baseball-sized gem at the end of the wand. The runes were carved out of the gem and laced with gold trim. Sin reached into the box and first removed the old book. She flipped through several pages until she came to one with a multicolored chart. Looking back up to the two men, Sin Kai spoke. What we have here is a magical identification kit. James, looking fascinated, asked a question. What sorts of things can it identify? Sin smiled lightly and answered, anything. Dr. Katz spoke in an almost hushed tone. Truly? Sin reached into the box, reaching in slowly and gently, removing the wand. She held it out in front of her face, eyeing some of the runes. Sin continued to speak. I will perform a scan of the sample materials. Their contents will be known by observing which rune lights up with what color. James inquired, Wow, what does it take to make one of those? Sin answered softly, still looking into the wand's gem. A naturally occurring diamond about the size of a fist, a bit of silver, a few drops of an infant's blood, and a good 4 years of magical education. James, looking mortified, asked, Why an infant's blood? Sin looked over to James with a facial expression that suggested he may not be ready for the answer. Because an infant is innocent. They don't project anything onto reality because they don't have an ego. An infant will see things as they really are. Alchemy takes that essence and captures it through the blood. All enchantments require essence, and for this task, the required essence is to be found in the blood of the innocent. James, with eyes wide open, replied, Whoa, way rad. Dr. Katz guffawed. Rad indeed. Sin lowered the wand, revealing a recessed bowl in the top, lined with gold. She pointed to the medical storage unit, then pointed to the top of the gem on the wand. Sin spoke while pointing. Let's start with Emily. James looked over at the doctor, who nodded in confirmation. James went over to the medical storage unit and carefully removed a sample of Emily's DNA. He brought the container over to Sin and, using a special tool, carefully shook some of the material into the receptacle bowl. Sin nodded, then gestured for the others to step back. Sin held the wand straight out in front of her face, staring at a light source directly behind the gem. Sin concentrated on the wand and chanted, Nixtra, Benshi, Has! A moment later, a wind picked up in the room as a blue flame erupted from the top of the gem on the wand, incinerating the ingredients. James and the doctor winced some at the flames and wind, but watched on. The gem then started to flash multiple colors, seemingly random at first, then going into a pattern. A few seconds later, the wind died down, as did the flame. The gem shined a bright white, and then various sections of the gem became illuminated with different colors. As the colors lit up, Sin walked over to a nearby computer terminal and focused one of the room's security cameras on the wand. She then pressed record on the HUD and made a separate recording of the wand's gem lighting up. A few seconds later, all of the light in the gem ceased. Sin then turned to the computer and enlarged the picture of the lit-up wand. Sin looked at James, then at William Katz, and spoke with satisfied excitement. There, now I just figure out what the colors mean. Dr. Katz spoke. Why, Miss Kai, I think you may be enjoying your work. Don't let anyone know, or you may never get a day off again. Warrant Officer Kai replied. I tried doing a day off. Didn't work out. Things got really explodey. Dr. Katz nodded with his eyes wide open. Miss Kai continued. But on most any given day, I'd rather be in the lab than on the battlefield. James blurted out. Your martial magic kicks ass, though. Miss Kai either ignored or didn't hear the comment as she was staring at the computer screen with the footage of the wand. A 3-second loop on the wand illuminating was playing on repeat. Miss Kai's mouth opened slightly at seeing the results. James and the doctor looked at each other after seeing Sin's expression. Sin Kai, looking shocked, exclaimed, No shit. Meanwhile, on Sub-Level 6 in the courtyard at 9:26 a.m. General Smith and Commander Singer stood on a metal platform overlooking the 60-foot orb containing a Necrosidius on an undead dragon. After a full day and a half of frantically smashing into the orb, they were finally fairly still and quiet, seeming to have given up on the idea of escape. Elite units were positioned about the room to cover every possible angle if something were to occur. The Necrosidius still sat upon the dragon, glaring at Mikhail, who had just stepped onto the platform and into their field of view. Mikhail and Gloria looked at each other for a moment, then turned to face the imprisoned enemies as the platform was lowered down to the eye level of the Necrosidius. From about 30 feet away, the Necrosidius could stare directly into the general's eyes. The glaring was met by Mikhail's unflinching cold stare. Mikhail held a remote control device in his left hand. With his right hand, he pushed a button on the remote. The Necrosidius prisoner barked out, "What are you doing?" Mikhail answered back rather casually, "I'm changing the interior temperature of that dome you're stuck in." The Necrosidius prisoner inquired, sounding panicked, "Change?" Mikhail looked up from the remote, wearing his reading glasses. He pushed them up slightly, then answered, "Yes, it's going to get much colder, which I know won't affect you. But that lizard of yours—" The general pursed his lips, shook his head, and made a sad face, saying, "He ain't gonna make it." A whooshing sound could be heard inside the dome as it started to fill up with liquid nitrogen. The dragon tried to move up the globe walls some, but could not get away from the rising liquid levels. The very touch of the liquid froze the undead flesh and made it so brittle that any bit supporting the creature's weight started to crumble. The dragon squelched and squealed as its feet crumbled away, followed by its ankles and then the lower legs. The dragon smashed its wings and upper claws against the force field of the dome, causing shockwaves of energy to go through it, also shocking its rider. The rider yelled out in fury, "Release me! Release me and I'll make your death swift! Release me or suffer!" After another moment of the rider screaming at the general, seemingly all at once, the dragon's frozen legs crumbled into dust, dipping the torso and its rider into liquid nitrogen. The dragon flailed around a bit, screeching, then froze completely and crumbled into dust as well. The rider flailed around some in the liquid as the general pressed another button on the remote, triggering a new sequence. From the bottom of the globe opened up a different valve, this time allowing the liquid to drain. A screen over the 5-foot-wide valve prevented materials from passing through. The rider stood on the drain, looking as though it were straining somehow, as the mud of the dragon corpse flowed down through. General Smith questioned mockingly, "What's wrong, guy? Can't turn into mist?" The rider glared with a look that could kill. General Smith continued, "All those blue orbs lining the wireframe of the globe? Those are power resonance dissipators. None of your usual tricks will work, nor will any other ability requiring the concentration of energy fields." The rider barked out, "What do you want?" General Smith pushed a button on his remote, sending several bolts of electricity through the dome. All the bolts aimed for went through and arced off of the Necrosidius inside, who yelled loudly in pain. After a few seconds, the electricity ceased and Mikhail spoke. "I will be asking the questions." The rider yelled out angrily, "What do you think you're doing?" Mikhail pressed the button again, sending torrents of electricity through the Necrosidius prisoner. It again screamed and gyrated about as it flailed. Mikhail spoke with giddy enthusiasm while Gloria smiled. "This is just 1,000 watts. This puppy here, it can go up to over 100,000. Gloria added, "Of course, you're still wet, so for now, all each jolt does is boil you and dry you off some. But when the water's boiled off," the general added, "you fry." General Smith hit the button again, sending a third and much longer burst of electricity through the Necrosidius, who screamed and flailed about. He growled, knelt on all fours, seething with rage. General Smith spoke once the prisoner stopped screeching. "First off, what do I ever call you?" The prisoner yelled violently, "Fuck you!" General Smith handed the remote to Commander Singer. Commander Singer spoke gently, "No, fuck you." Commander Singer pushed the button again, this time holding it for 3 times as long. Steam and smoke were rising from the body of the Necrosidius, which inside the sphere could not regenerate from injuries. General Smith yawned, then turned to Gloria Singer and spoke. I'll be working on that speech for the services tomorrow. Keep on zapping him till he either decides to cooperate or burns down to his bones. If he fries too much, we can just reanimate him tomorrow. The general knelt down to look at his prisoner at eye level and spoke, tauntingly, waving a hand. Good night, bitch. The general then headed for the elevator to his home office, leaving Commander Gloria Singer in charge of the interrogation. Back at Special Ward 13 on Sublevel 7, 9:31 a.m. James and Dr. Katz responded in unison. Celestial? Miss Kai nodded in the affirmative. We've run the test 3 times. I wanted to be sure before I spoke. But, yes, there is celestial essence in her DNA. Dr. Katz puzzled at this. I'm afraid I understand very little about celestial material. I mean, what is it? Miss Kai gently placed the wand back into the black box. She went back to the computer terminal and pulled up footage of the section of the wand glowing a bright white. Pointing to the glowing section, she said, Olmir Alto, the nature of Omniscience, celestial. Celestial essence is not material. Rather, it is an energy that is capable of manifesting force, intellect, or consciousness. James added, So, it's pure energy? Miss Kai clarified, It is said in material science that particles and waves are really the same thing, operating at different levels. The same could be said of this situation. Some form of celestial energy has bonded with her material body. Dr. Katz added, Why would someone do that? Miss Kai stared at the screen for another moment, then replied, I've no idea. Until I determine the nature of the celestial energy, I won't be able to make that determination. Dr. Katz nodded, fished a card out of his pocket, then turned to James. The doctor handed the card to James and said, Take this. Go down to Evidence Locker 5. Retrieve Dr. Weiser's research notes and bring them straight to the lab. James nodded enthusiastically and raised a foot to take off sprinting. Just as James took off into a dash, Dr. Katz yelled, And don't stop at the video arcades on the way! James disappeared in a flash, then reappeared just long enough to say, Got it! Then again vanished off into a puff of wind. About 5 seconds later, James reappeared with a large duffel bag full of Dr. Weiser's notes. Slightly winded, he set the bag of notes down on the table. Dr. Katz took out the piles of papers and notebooks, then divided them into 2 piles. He took one pile and set it down next to his computer terminal. He picked up the second pile and took it over to a third computer terminal and set them down next to the keyboard. Dr. Katz then addressed James and Sin. Miss Kai, do you have a means of determining the nature of the celestial energy, or at least its function? Miss Kai answered, I have the appropriate text in my home office. The doctor replied, Could you bring those here? Miss Kai answered, I may need to consult more than 200 texts. Dr. Katz nodded. Then do your research at home and notify me the second you find anything. Miss Kai responded, Yes, sir, about faced, and left the research lab. Dr. Katz then addressed James. You and I, young man, have a lot of work to do. James looked at the pile of papers and notes next to the computer and asked, Whose computer terminal is this? Dr. Katz lifted his head with a slight smirk. That's your work area. James looked at the computer terminal in disbelief. For me? But the guys always told me I was the hyper dumbass kid in the way. And now I get to help? The doctor's face became very serious looking as he spoke. James, I was the one who put in the report that led to you gaining rank on a trial basis. I put in that word because I believe you can do the work. So get to it, Warrant Officer Battalion. Suddenly, James rushed forward and embraced the doctor in a big bear hug, actually lifting him up off the floor. Dr. Katz found himself flabbergasted by the sudden surge of affection. Dr. Katz cleared his throat loudly. James relinquished his grasp and carefully unruffled the doctor's clothing. James started apologizing profusely. I'm so sorry, sir. It won't happen again. Dr. Katz took a breath and responded, At ease, Mr. Battalion. I'm sure you'll do a fine job. We just need to work on your impulsiveness some. You're 15 years old. Don't expect to get it right the first time. Just take a deep breath, follow the directives given, and if you don't know something, ask. James collected himself some. Yes, sir. Dr. Katz assured James, putting a hand on his right shoulder. You're not a child anymore. You'll do fine. But if my husband ever saw you hugging me like that, it might not be so good for either of us, you know? Both of them chuckled a bit at that idea, and the humor seemed to ease the situation some. Dr. Katz then spoke more enthusiastically. All right, let's get to work. Warrant Officer Battalion sounded off, yes, sir, and went to his terminal to begin working, his first day as an official Matic Corps officer. Miss Kai carefully put the wand and book back into the black box, and then tucked it under her left arm. She then took a flash drive and made a copy of the footage of the wand. With that secured in her right breast pocket, she used the index and middle fingers of her right hand to illustrate a pair of legs walking. She then walked the fingers forward, then zipped them back to their starting position. In a flash of pale blue light, Sin vanished from the lab and reappeared in her home office. James let his curiosity get the better of him and inquired, Is it true that Miss Kai is over 100 years old? Dr. Katz chuckled, almost nervously, but answered, Sin Kai is not a native to our Earth, but was born on Tarathar, on the other side of the galaxy. James nodded as he listened. The doctor continued, She's 287 years old, but appears to be no older than 25 in Earth years. James inquired, How's that possible? Dr. Katz explained further, On Tarathar, the average human can live to be about 600 years old. At the age of 98, she was discovered by General Smith, and was recruited into Matic as a teacher of the arcane arts. Before that, she had been born a sorceress, and at the age of 13 was recruited into the McGuire Academy of Magic and Paranormal Studies. With a 70-year education in magic, alchemy, enchanting, legend, and lore, she established herself as one of Matic's foremost experts on all things paranormal, second only to Agent Nightwatch, Connor Greenleaf. James commented, Oh, wow. Dr. Katz added, But that's between you and I. In some circles, it would be thought an impossible impertinence to ask such a question of a lady. James added, She looks and acts young, though she's not as pretty as... Dr. Katz raised an eyebrow. Not as pretty as... James blushed some, then changed subjects. I think I need to be working. Dr. Katz then went over to James's workstation and spoke candidly in a low tone. I know it hasn't been easy for you, losing your whole family at the age of 11. Then you became ill and fought for your own life for 3 years before you found a cure. The same cure that gave you these abilities, and I was responsible for all of that. James interjected, turning in his seat to face Dr. Katz. Those things aren't your fault. You've been like a second father to me. Dr. Katz responded softly, Not my fault, perhaps, but I did take responsibility for you. And you're not 11 anymore. You're a young man now. I can never replace your father or anyone else, but I can be your friend. James nodded in agreement. Dr. Katz spoke once more. Now it's time for you to justify my faith in you. Let's find a way to help Emily. Now in her office, Miss Kai took a few steps to her old writing desk, set down the black box, took out the flash drive, and inserted it into the desktop computer. The media player started playing the 15-second loop of the wand lighting up. She paused a moment to smile at her Goodbye Kitty posters. Goodbye Kitty is a chibi-style cartoon cat with X's in her eyes, a pink nose with stitches in it, and drooling fangs, sometimes depicted with deadly ninja weaponry, and sometimes with giant guns. The posters were artist renderings of Goodbye Kitty in combat against various mythological monsters, such as Hetlar the Destroyer and Ronald Frump. The largest poster was of Goodbye Kitty firing off a pistol into a monster's mouth, causing the back of the monster's head to explode brain matter everywhere. The caption underneath the poster said, Get ready to have your mind blown. The posters looked somewhat ominous under the room's black lights. She walked over to the opposite side of the office, the wall of which was lined with bookshelves from side to side and from bottom to top. There were 222 books on the shelves, sorted first by category and secondly by alphabetical order, in the language of Berenia called Ancient Kurgathan. Sin began scanning the shelves, looking for a particular book. Suddenly, she felt a presence. Looking out the corner of her right eye, she vaguely saw a figure standing in the room. Sin looked over to see the figure. It was a translucent bluish white and bore a strong resemblance to Connor Greenleaf, the comatose patient in the next room over from Emily's cryo-suspension unit. Shocksome, Sin gasped, "Who? Miss... Mr. Greenleaf?" No sooner than she had uttered the words, a book fell off the shelves and the visage disappeared, as did the feeling of the presence. Sin looked down at the officer's tie-dyed carpet, trying to make sense of what she had just encountered. She then noticed the book that had fallen onto the floor. The book was entitled Astral Projection and Travel. Miss Kai knelt down and picked up the book, mouthing the title as she silently read it. She quickly made the connection, stood abruptly, set the book back onto its slot on the shelf, then took out her Matic phone. She dialed Dr. Kat's number and waited impatiently for him to pick up. On the third ring, the doctor picked up the line. Before the doctor could even answer, Miss Kai spoke. "I know what's wrong with your other patient." Dr. Katz responded. "What? Miss Kai?" Miss Kai continued. "Agent Nightwatch, I know what's wrong with him. I'm on my way over." Miss Kai cast a spell, this time with her fingers walking backward, then shooting forward. At the conclusion of the spell, she vanished and reappeared inside Ward 13. She emerged from the lab, putting her phone away. Miss Kai spoke softly, but still managed to startle the two men with her appearance. "I know what's wrong with him. He appeared to me." Dr. Katz reacted. "God damn it, girl, you nearly gave me a fucking heart attack." Miss Kai squinted and replied, "You're not even that old. Well, I mean, you are, but you're physically what, 55? Dr. Katz let out a sigh. "I started receiving the anti-aging injections at the age of 62. Miss Kai changed the subject. "Anyway, I saw Mr. Greenleaf in my office." Dr. Katz glanced over at the bed with Connor Greenleaf laying on it, still in a mysterious coma. "How could that be possible?" Miss Kai walked over to the bed, looking down at Mr. Greenleaf, then looked up from the bed, addressing the doctor. "Astral projection. He traveled, or at least projected his visage, and knocked this book off of my bookshelf at home." Miss Kai held up the book, waving it around slightly. Dr. Katz furrowed his brow some. "I can't read that." Miss Kai responded, "Yes, it's in ancient Kirgathan. The book title is Astral Projection and Travel. In any case, he caused a strong wind in my office to pull this book off my bookshelf. That can't be a coincidence." Young Mr. Battalion turned in his seat. "Agent Nightstalker? I thought that was urban legend. That's who that is?" Miss Kai answered, "Quite real and very confidential." Mr. Battalion swallowed, then turned back to his computer, saying, "I didn't see or hear anything." Miss Kai nodded, turning to Dr. Katz. "Your pupil learns fast." Dr. Katz asked, "So what do we do about that?" Miss Kai looked over to Agent Greenleaf. "First, we have to determine where he is." Dr. Katz scratched his head, still pondering. "I don't follow." Miss Kai let out a sigh with a smile and spoke to the doctor. "A person is not an ego inside a bag of skin, but one can become separated from their physical identity while still remembering it." Miss Kai walked over to the bed and placed her open left hand over Agent Greenleaf's forehead, palm down. She chanted something quietly, moving her open hand in minuscule counterclockwise circles. After a moment of doing that with the doctor looking on, she stopped and turned to face him. Miss Kai spoke pithily. "He is not at home." The doctor only appeared more confused. "Then, where is he?" Miss Kai replied. "Simply put, the source of his coma is not physical. If he were only in a coma, we would have time. However, this is far worse." Miss Kai set the book in her right hand down near a computer terminal. Concentrating on the book, she placed her left hand over her eyes, then her right. She then removed the inner left hand, leaving the right hand. A few seconds later, a glimmer of light went over the book, translating it into the native language of whomever looked at it within the mind of the perceiver. She then opened the book to a passage with illustrations of persons existing outside their bodies and different stages of merging with the universe. The imagery suggested that a person comes out of the universe and goes back into it when they cease to be a person anymore. The passage in the book read, Once unjoined from the physical construct, anima may retain some memory of its former self, so long as the body is kept intact. Once the body is destroyed by fire or the decay of time, so that no marrow or blood remains, the anima may not return to that body, nor that identity, except through eidetic recovery via phylactery or crystal of diamond. However, the longer the anima is absent from the body, the greater the chances that its identity will be lost. In cases where the anima has been separated from the body, it may be possible to rejoin the anima to its host, so long as said anima has not been absorbed back into the great non-duality. Once that occurs, attempting to place the anima back into the body will result only in the animation of the host, without will or personality, but with knowledge. Such a host would be a juju zombie, with knowledge and ability bound to the necromancer's will. To be certain that identity is restored, one must first be certain of the state of the anima being called. If the anima is unbound, the person may be restored to some semblance of their former self. Otherwise, an undead servant is created. After 3 days without a phylactery, the anima will be returned to the non-duality, and the person can never be recovered. Sin spoke as Dr. Katz read this passage. Even the Son of God needed to rise on the 3rd day, and if we don't rejoin Mr. Greenleaf's anima to his physical identity within 3 days, he will be lost forever. Dr. Katz's eyes were open wide as he spoke. What in the holy hell does that even mean? Miss Kai countered with her own question. How long has Agent Greenleaf been in his coma? The doctor answered, About 2 days. Miss Kai added, Then we don't have long. If we can't get him back today, we never will. Mr. Battalion asked, How do we help him? Miss Kai turned to face the 2 men and said, Each of you grab a shoulder. James simply did as instructed right away, placing his open right hand on Miss Kai's right shoulder. Dr. Katz did so hesitantly, raising an eyebrow. Dr. Katz started to speak. How is... Before the doctor could finish the sentence, the 3 of them appeared in Miss Kai's home office. James exclaimed, Whoa, sick! Startled, the doctor reacted, A little warning next time, please. The doctor removed his hand as soon as the 3 appeared in Miss Kai's office, but young James continued to hold on to Sin's shoulder for a moment, staring at Sin's beautiful face, green eyes, pink lipstick, and dark eyeshadow. Dr. Katz cleared his throat rather loudly as Sin's gaze met James, but not in a mutually lost way. James then realized what he was doing, gasped, and removed his hand swiftly. Dr. Katz let out a sigh, shaking his head. James exclaimed, I'm sorry. Sin Kai faced James with an understanding smile and said, You're still young and very full of hormones, and I am gorgeous. You've probably never seen such beauty, so you're forgiven. James lowered his gaze to the floor, blushing and embarrassed. James looked up, cleared his throat, and spoke, still slightly red in the face. We're here to help the agent. I don't have clearance to know about the existence of, right? So, what's our next step? Dr. Katz chuckled slightly hearing this, though impressed. Miss Kai looked at the doctor and said in a small voice, He does learn quickly. Miss Kai then turned to face James and spoke, Go to the closet next to the desk. We need 3 candles and a box of matches. James nodded, Right, and dashed to the closet to procure the items. Miss Kai faced the doctor and spoke in an official tone. Sir, we will need to have Mr. Greenleaf moved here to my residence. Dr. Katz replied, I'll have to give the order personally, as per the General's directives. Miss Kai nodded and replied, Ring my bell when you get back. She then made a flicking motion with her right hand, directed at the doctor, sending him back to Ward 13, flinging him backwards into a vortex. He landed abruptly at his destination, on his feet, an unharmed, but slightly shaken man. James returned, saying, I got the candles and matches. Miss Kai nodded. Very good. Follow me, Mr. Battalion. Mr. Battalion followed Miss Kai to a door toward the rear of the office. She walked up to the door, which had no doorknob or clearly marked way of being opened. Pressing her palm against the upper center portion of the door, Miss Kai recited a phrase in ancient Kurgathan, using a half-whisper, half-low tone. Shenbo Kima. The door started to glow a faint pale blue, then vanished entirely. Miss Kai stepped into the dark room, disappearing from view. Her hand reappeared from the darkness, gesturing Mr. Battalion to enter as well. He stepped into the room, cautiously, holding on to the 3 candles which were set into metallic dishes, with the box of matches in his right pocket. Upon entering the room, Mr. Battalion found it to be less dark than it had first appeared. Although the walls were black, strange-looking runes were scrawled all about, illuminating the room with a faint glow like that of a black light. On the floor was a 13-pointed star inside of a circle. The circle took up about half the space of the 13 by 13 room. James gasped slightly, seeing this strange room. "Wow, what is this?" Sin answered softly. "A phylactery, or you might say a soul chamber." Staring at the 13-pointed star in the circle, James inquired, "Isn't 13 a number symbolizing bad luck?" Sin giggled lightly. "It depends upon how you've been indoctrinated," James inquired with an upward inflection, with eyes open wide. "Indoctrinated?" Sin simply replied, "What to one may seem suspect may be entirely holy to another." James became even more inquisitive, asking, "But what does it actually mean?" Sin didn't answer, but instead gave a directive. "Take the candles and put them on the inner rim of the circle, making a triangle formation." While James went about doing that, Sin countered with her own question. "Do you have a religion, James?" James placed a candle just inside the circle and answered, Not really. I mean, when my parents were alive, they brought me to church and stuff, but it never made any sense to me." Sin commented as James placed the candle, "Be sure that the handle of each candle dish points to the center of the circle." After a pause, Sin continued the conversation. "What about it didn't make sense to you?" Placing the second candle, James answered, "Well, the religion itself seemed to say that God was love, but the people in the religion seemed to hate on anyone who had a different point of view. That seemed hypocritical to me." Sin inquired, "What do you think?" Carefully placing the third candle, James answered, "When I turned 13, I decided to read books about all the religions." Sin asked, "Did you find them helpful?" James answered almost listlessly, "Not really. I mean, none of it made any literal sense, yet in metaphor it all seemed to point to one thing. It was so confusing, I decided to stop looking or thinking about it." Very curious, Sin asked, "What were the religions pointing you to?" James answered in a less monotonous tone, "Stuff like love your neighbor, don't judge, don't be a dick, maybe have some sort of first principles, maybe." Sin smiled at James as he placed the last candle, saying, "I think you understood them perfectly." James laughed slightly. "Or maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see." Sin asked, "Have you ever had an IQ test?" James answered rather matter-of-factly, 247, but that doesn't mean I can't learn. I mean, I've met people who are supposed to be less smart, but everyone seems to have something to offer." Sin, raising an eyebrow, replied, "Intellect, wisdom, and humility. Never lose that combination, James. You'll do just fine, if you keep an open mind." After making sure the 3 candles were perfectly aligned, James stood and faced Sin, saying, "I hope so, but what's up with the number 13? Sin answered softly, "Numbers have significance. The number 1 points to unity, oneness. The number 3 points to triumvirate and unity. It is said that man is a trinity, body, mind, and spirit." James answered back, "Like the Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit." Sin replied warmly, seeing James understand, "Yes, in the Western religions, God is thought of as separate from man and above him. But in the Eastern religions, God and man are thought to be identical, a concept some call Brahman, having a God self that we are initially unaware of, instead thinking themselves to be the ego, a false idea of identity, or the body." James answered, "I read about that stuff, and I think I get those concepts, but I still don't understand the 13 part." Sin asked, "Have you heard of the idea of the 13th hour?" James nodded. "Yes?" Sin continued, "Yet there are only 12 hours on a clock. The 13th hour exists outside of the construct of time, as do we when not here in the material plane. Right now, Agent Greenleaf is not in unity, being separated from his bodily identity. 13 is a conduit for unity, and has the power to make him whole again, reuniting his body, mind, and spirit." Amazed, James asked, "And you learn all this stuff in magical college?" Sin answered, and through vigorous research and practice on my own time. You can learn a lot from a teacher or a book, but you learn far more from personal experience. James stood after placing all the candles, and Sid nodded in approval. After a momentary pause, James inquired, "Do you have a religion, Miss Kai?" Sin thought for a moment before speaking as the two stood in the strange lighting of the soul chamber. "More of a Gnostic philosophy than a religion." James inquired, "Like an agnostic?" Sin, Sin nodded slightly, responding, "Something like that. Considering that human beings tend to see what they are looking for, the many ideas we project onto people and things, and the utterly mysterious yet bounded ideas we have about God, I would say a phrase often uttered by Hindu mystics. Neti neti." James responded, "No concept." Sin continued, "Precisely. I believe that human senses are completely inadequate to even attain to what truth is, let alone understand something as infinite as God. So instead of trying to put a name on something, a Gnostic observes the pattern. In the end, all that can be said of a thing is what we have observed. It is said that the Brahman can have no direct knowledge of itself, and I believe that humanity and God are really the same thing, expressed in both finite and infinite forms, with any idea of separateness being a total illusion. We just are." James, looking slightly confused, asked, "We are what?" Sin replied, "We just are what we are. Anything that can be said of anything is but a label we put on it, because, as alluded to before, if all things are one thing without separateness, and God and humanity are the same thing in different forms, and the Brahman and Godhead can have no knowledge of itself, then that means that no one can know, and that truth is simply the state of things, irrespective of thoughts, impressions, or names, one grand non-duality of nothing and everything, existing for its own sake, eternally playing peekaboo with itself in an infinite number of finite forms, all constituting one grand holistic nature." James puzzled a moment, then responded, "So, consciousness is all there is, and everything else is just a label or an idea projected onto the thing?" Sin smiled and answered with giddy joy, "Exactly." James's eyes got wide as he examined the idea, exclaiming, "Whoa, that's deep." Just then, Miss Kai's doorbell rang, signifying the doctor's return. Miss Kai stepped out of the chamber and into her office, checking a security camera being broadcast on her computer, verifying that it was the doctor and his staff. She leaned down to the computer, pressed a few keys, and the front door fell open. Dr. Katz gave the camera a wave and signaled the 4 medical workers with him to carry the stretcher into the building. Dr. Katz led the nurses through the kitchen, past the living area, and into the soul chamber room. Miss Kai directed the nurses upon entry to the room, "Set him in the center of the circle, and remove the stretcher. We will also need to remove his clothing. There must be nothing between him and the circle." The head nurse looked to the doctor for verification. He nodded in the affirmative, and the nurses did as instructed. The nurses carefully set Agent Greenleaf down, rolled him off of the stretcher onto his stomach, then back onto his back again. They then removed the hospital gown, folded it neatly into a square, then set it on top of his groin so as to leave the agent some dignity. Miss Kai protested, "No, there must not be anything touching him except the floor itself." The head nurse reluctantly removed the folded-up gown, then turned Agent Greenleaf onto his side so as to allow one leg to cover up his bits. Dr. Katz addressed the nurses. "You all took the day off, and this never happened. Dismissed." The head nurse answered, "Yes, sir." Miss Kai warned, "You should all leave this room." Dr. Katz inquired in a concerned tone, "Why? What's going to happen?" Miss Kai looked at the doctor, then at James, then redirected her attention to the doctor, saying, "This room is a conduit for a forced incarnation. When performing a resurrection or forced incarnation, a portal to the spirit realm is opened. Sometimes what you're calling forth is not the only thing to arrive, and if that happens, it's best for everyone that whatever comes through be trapped in here, where you will all be safe from it." Looking spooked, James inquired with a stammer, "Whoa, what might come through?" Sin faced James and answered in a serious tone, "A demon, perhaps. Even worse, a soul may escape from the cycle of reincarnation and wreak havoc on the living, unbounded by mortal constraints of power and morality." Such a being would envy the living and would constitute a form both grotesque and powerful. At least if the chamber remains closed, such a creature would remain trapped. James inquired further, "But what about you?" Sin responded, "My risk, my responsibility." Dr. Katz protested, "Too dangerous. I can't allow that." Miss Kai responded harshly, "It's this or you may as well chuck him into the ground right now. Those are your choices." Dr. Katz took out his phone, saying, "I'm calling the general on this." Miss Kai politely asked James for the matches, to which James complied and handed them over. She then raised her right hand, then thrust it forward, causing an unseen force to propel the two men out of the room, bowling them both over onto their backs, unharmed but outside of the room. With the nurses, the doctor, and James out of the room, Sin uttered a short phrase in the magical language. A moment later, in a flash of pale light, the open doorway vanished, filling the gap in the wall, without so much as a single seam on either side. Dr. Katz arose and stomped over to the computer terminal, pulling up the camera inside the room and activated the comm system. The doctor then yelled into the microphone, "This is insane! Why take such a risk?" Sin replied, "This man has saved my life. Twice. There's no way I'm not going to at least attempt to return that kind of karma." Sin then uttered a phrase that caused the computer to restart, severing their connection. The doctor looked over at James, who was just now standing up, having witnessed the whole event. James asked the doctor, "Didn't you tell me that you feel better when you help others, even if it hurts you?" Dr. Katz exclaimed, "Yes, but this is madness." James inquired, "Aren't you Christian?" Looking both confused and a little irate, the doctor answered, "Yes, but what does that have to do with this?" James posed a question. When Jesus was crucified, what if the disciples told Jesus to stay home that day because it was too dangerous? Dr. Katz responded, "Jesus died for the whole world, not for just one vampire." James argued back, "And do you think Jesus would have not died for you if you were the only person?" Dr. Katz snapped back, "That's preposterous. Who would have crucified him?" James answered, "You would, because that's human nature, to sacrifice another to save themselves. Jesus didn't care if you were a Jew or not, but I guess if you're a vampire, you don't get that privilege." The doctor stammered, flabbergasted. Well, I mean," James continued, "she's willing to risk herself just to save just one vampire. She's a total nihilist, and yet she's more Christ-like than you are." Dr. Katz just stared at James, trembling with fists clenched. James called out the doctor. "I call you on your own hypocrisy, and your first reaction is violence. How very Christian of you. Go ahead, try to hit me if it makes you feel better about yourself. Or you can take a walk. I'll be here waiting for Miss Kai." Fuming and still livid, Dr. Katz unclenched his fist as James' words started to really sink in. There was a long, awkward silence that felt like an eternity for both men. Then the computer restarted, and a live feed of the room came up on the monitor. Both turned their attention to the screen. Inside the chamber, Sin Kai had lit the 3 candles and was now standing in the northeast corner of the room. Miss Kai put her hands together so that her palms touched and placed her hands just under her chin. Closing her eyes, she began to chant in ancient Kyrgyzstan, "Rel, no haste, sun, fama ke nutra, arianke, mahufi, sobra dusta, tonge, nugrat donfoni." Her volume and emphasis on each syllable increased with each phrase. "Fing du hasta, no me keng fulag marana, nos du condese." The runes on the walls started to flicker, as did the lights in the room. The ground started to shake, just a little at first. A high-pitched tritone then filled the air, canceling all sounds but the chanting. The entire base started to experience an earthquake, about a 4 on the Richter scale. Steadying herself in the corner, Sin continued the reincarnation incantation in the ancient celestial language of Kyrgyzstan. "Un jamama fe nokrela, un das don kamala, nostrul condese." Vapors and trails of light started to fill the chamber, darting around in every direction, around and through Agent Greenleaf's body and all about the room, permeating every space but the one that Sin stood in. A deep vibrating, like that of 1,000 bass chants, began to emanate from everywhere inside the Matic base. People everywhere on base stopped in their tracks, mystified as to what was going on. Sin continued without interruption as the body of Agent Greenleaf started to twitch and convulse. Kali, Kalima, Kalima, Shattide, Klaatu, Varata, Nektu, Rendre, Lifa, Rendre, Lifa, Rendre, Lifa! As the body of Agent General Lean, as the body of Agent Greenleaf became even more disturbed and contorted, Sin reached into her left pants pocket and produced a pint-sized vial of holy oil with an ancient holy symbol etched into the side of the bottle. She poured the oil in the groove of the circle on the floor. Agent Greenleaf's eyes opened bright red, and a pair of goat-like horns cracked through his skull and started to protrude from the sides of his head. Seeing this, Sin immediately took out a match, struck it, and set fire to the holy oil. The body of Agent Greenleaf started to levitate, rising 4 feet from the surface of the floor, still contorting and moving about in jumpy movements, almost as though under the effects of a strobe light. The deafening sounds started to dissipate, and the ruins inside the room went dark, leaving only the visage of a pair of red pinpoints of light as Agent Greenleaf's body started to stand up while still hovering. His back arched unnaturally, as though he were suspended by invisible strings. He took in a deep breath as wicked-looking fangs grew out of his mouth. A sound similar to that of a distorted bass guitar being played with a bow started to emanate from his mouth. Outside, James and William Katz could only watch on in shock and partial horror. The earth stopped quaking, and the runes in the room lit up again. Sin tried to yell above the loud and distorted noises emanating from Connor's voice. "Connor Greenleaf, son of Vladimiros, return to your body!" Connor's body, standing erect and still hovering 2 feet in the air, spoke in a grunting and distorted tone. "No. This one belongs to us." The demon-possessed corpse of Agent Greenleaf lashed out to strike, but could not reach beyond the boundary of the burning holy oil. It screamed, thrashing about in a cylindrical prison of holy fire. Sin called out, "You will leave at once. This body is not yours." They responded, "We are Legion. You cannot stop us. We will kill it." Sin conjured up a force of psionic energy, temporarily restraining the legion of demons inside Connor's corpse, keeping it from flailing about. The legion of demons protested loudly. "Once that holy fire goes out, we'll tear out your throat, drink your juices, and fuck your tiny ass as you bleed out." Sin pushed back, further constraining and flailing the contorted mass. "You will not kill me, and you will not kill him." Sin started to breathe heavily and in forced burst as she strained against the strength of the legion inside Connor's body. She trembled, inhaled, and exhaled forcefully with each breath as the legion strained to break free of her grasp. The legion screamed even more loudly, echoing throughout the entirety of the base. The earth started to tremble again. Sin resumed commanding the legion, "Give him back!" The legion strained all the harder, forcing Sin beyond her limits. Sin called out again, "Daddy! It's me! Sin! Please come back home! Daddy!" James and Dr. Katz looked at each other and exclaimed at the same time, "Daddy?" The earth trembled even more violently as the floor of the room started to crack. With a snapping crackle, the holy circle was broken. The flames were immediately snuffed out, and the legion-possessed body of Connor rushed forward with violent intensity. Before Sin could even react, the legion had Connor's hands around Sin's throat. They unhinged their jaw, opening their mouth nearly a foot. The vampiric fangs grew to a length of 6 inches, dripping with black pus. The legion hissed and roared to intimidate, while simultaneously strangling Sin. With her eyes wide open and in terror, and conjuring all her resolve, she just barely uttered a single magical phrase. When she cast a spell, a small metal vase vanished from her bedroom and appeared in her left hand. She opened it and took out the small lock of hair, which was tied up in a weathered-looking light pink bow. Sin held up the lock of hair so that it was right in front of the legion's eyes. Sin barely forced a whisper, and could manage only a partial sentence. Remember, your I father, I father. All at once the Legion stopped its rampage. Connor's body let out a long exhale, spewing out a long trail of black smoke. His eyes slowly returned to normal, then his face and body shape, and lastly his grip on her throat started to wane. He dropped Sin to the floor. She managed to utter a single phrase again, reopening the door to the chamber, then passed out from sheer exhaustion. Connor walked backwards, staring at his hands in terror, then fell to the floor, sobbing in a collapsed heap. James and Dr. Katz burst into the room to see Sin passed out, slumped over in a corner, and a still nude Agent Greenleaf collapsed on the floor in a fetal position and sobbing, but very much revived. They could do little but stand there with mouths agape, astonished at the entire set of events. Mere seconds later, several dozen heavily armed security personnel swarmed into the building.